Yemeni inscriptions, Iraqi chronicles, Hijazi poetry, a reconstruction of the meaning of Israʼ in Qur'an. Nathaniel Miller. Abstract. The term Israʼ, based on the first verse of Surah, is typically rendered as night journey. There is little compelling evidence that this was the original meaning of the Quranic text, and medieval lexicographers and exegetes preserved a number of alternative meanings, such as that Azra was a denominal verb meaning, to travel through the uplands, al-Sara. Another explanation is that Azra is a denominal verb of the noun Sariya, place. Saraya, a military expedition. By drawing on early historiographical descriptions of Saraya and South Arabian inscriptions, which give evidence that the word Sariya is of Sabaic origin, the Quranic meaning of Azra was evidently something like, to send on a royal expedition. Early Islamic Arabic poetic texts also offer extremely compelling evidence that the first Muslims were familiar with some of the key concepts of South Arabian royal authority as they appear in Sabaic inscriptions. Keywords: Jahiliya, Quran, night journey. Introduction. Any consideration of the Isra narrative, usually translated as Muhammad's night journey from Mecca to Jerusalem, must begin by taking account of its one disadvantage, that none of this was at first glance to be found in the scripture itself, as Joseph Van Es puts it, with reference to both Q and Q. Point 1. In Ibn Ishaq's early Sirah narrative, the Isra based on Q denotes the prophet's journey in the company of the angel Gabriel to Jerusalem, where he meets Abraham, Moses and Jesus. Point 2. The Miraj based on Q denotes his ascent to heaven, where he meets many of the same figures, and is given the 5 daily prayers. Point 3. At some point these two narratives were fused. Point 4. However, Q. 1J Van S. Vision. The clearest base text for the narrative is conventionally understood as, Glory be unto journey. The clearest base text for the narrative is conventionally understood as, Glory be unto he who took his servant on a night journey, Azra by Abdihi Laylan, from the sacred place of prayer al-Masjid al-Haram, to the furthest place of prayer al-Masjid al-Aqsa, upon which we have sent down our blessing, that we might show him some of our signs. He is the all-hearing, the all-seeing. Point 5. Extensive scholarly discussion has revolved around the identification of al-Masjid al-Aqsa with the terrestrial Jerusalem. A number of Orientalists have argued that the original Quranic Isra was a journey to heaven, a stance most recently defended by Heribert Busser. Point 6. Angelica Newerth and Uri Rubin have both argued for a terrestrial understanding of al-Masjid al-Aqsa. Point 7. The original reception by the Quranic audience is obscured by Umayyad era and later polemic about whether Muhammad could have had a physical vision of God, according to Joseph Van S. Point 8. Absent from the debate, however, is much attention to the etymology. Absent from the debate, however, is much attention to the etymology of the verb Azra, from which the noun Isra, not itself found in the Quran, is derived. Moving away from meanings connected to night travel helps partially explain an unsatisfying redundancy in the Arabic that perplexed medieval Muslim exegetes. Why is the adverbial laylan by night used if Azra itself means to send on a night journey? Azra can, however, be elucidated even further based on 3 sources: the Sabaic inscriptions of South Arabia, early Arabic historiographical usage, and pre-Islamic poetry. Rather than read Azra, a form IV verb, as a transitive form of the form Isara meaning, to travel by night, it is preferable to read it as a denominal verb derived from Sariya, place. Saraya, Sariyat, a military expedition taking place at any time of day or night, thus meaning, to send on a royal or military expedition. The word Sariya is cognate with, and probably derived from, a Sabaic usage found in monumental 6th century inscriptions of South Arabian monarchs. The Sariya military expedition forms part of a small cluster of ideological terms that the early Muslim polity inherited from the defunct South Arabian monarchy, just as they inherited religious terms. Point 9. Early Muslims did not simply adopt the institution of the Sariya without modification. It was distinguished as relative Early Muslims did not simply adopt the institution of the Sariya without modification. It was distinguished as an instrument of prophetic delegation, thus allowing for the relative centralization of his authority. At the same time, at some point it attained both a proselytizing as well as a military role. The Sariya was a mission, both military and religious. The Sariya was not the only institution imported from South Arabia, and early Arabic poetry in particular offers a hitherto poorly exploited resource for establishing the cultural. 5. The early and political mechanisms through which the early Islamic Hijaz interacted with South Arabia. Muqaddam poets contemporary to the first Muslims depict a worldview in which South Arabian notions of monarchy mixed side by side with emergent Islamic notions of prophetic rule, and they offer a view into some of the military and ideological preoccupations of early Islam that were later discarded. Early poets may also help us speculate as to the reception of the Quranic Isra, if we understand it as God sending the prophet on a divine saria. This Isra may well have been understood by its contemporaries as a long-distance military expedition of the sort undertaken by South Arabian monarchs or Hijazi tribal leaders. The goal of such an expedition must thus have been understood as the terrestrial Jerusalem, either as a territorial heritage of the early Muslims, or as a backdrop for the prophet qua folkloric Arabian spiritual hero, suppressing the symbol of older religions. Isra, problems of definition. Isra, problems of definition in tafsir and Quranic usage. The exegetic tradition, from a very early date, presupposes the seerah narrative of Isra in interpreting the word Azra. This is already the case in the tafsir of Muqatil ibn Sulaiman d. the earliest completely extant Quranic exegetical text. He understands al-Masjid al-Aqsa as Jerusalem Beit al-Maqdis, where Muhammad was prescribed the 5 prayers, given the opportunity to drink from one of the 3 rivers, milk, honey, and wine, from which he chose milk and saw Barak, his steed. 10. This led in time to attempts to explain the redundancy of the expression Azra by Abdihi Laylan. Such attempts were initially implicit rather than explicit. Al-Tabari d. relies on a variant attributed to the companion Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman, min al-Layl, to gloss the adverbial Laylan, but he does not discuss the issue further. 11. Al-Zamakhshari d. in his Al-Kashaf, returns to this variant in his reading of the verse, and was the first to explicitly pose the question, if you asked, does not Isra always take place by night, so what then does it mean to mention Laylan? He states, I would respond that Laylan, in the indefinite, signifies the short length of the Isra, Taklil Mudat al-Isra, and that he sent him on a 40-night journey from Mecca to Syria in the space of a single portion of the night, thus the use of the indefinite indicates the meaning of portion Nes al-Badiyah. 12. Al-Zamakhshari is relying, implicitly, on the variant min al-Layl, of the night which could indeed mean Bad al-Layl, part of the night. 13. In addition to Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman, he cites Ibn Mas'ud as a source for this phrasing. However, neither al-Tabari nor al-Zamakhshari are interested in the possibility that Laylan might offer a different meaning from its variant min al-Layl. Moreover, min al-Layl could have other meanings, and the seerah narratives are obviously dictating the interpretation of the Quranic text. Nevertheless, 10 Muqatil ibn Sulaiman al-Balkhi, Tafsir Muqatil ibn Sulaiman, ed. R. M. Shihata, Beirut, 2, pp. Interestingly, Barak is mentioned as one of the Another inadequacy of these explanations, from an historical point of view, emerges from their atomistic approach, typical of the tafsir genre. Comparisons are not made across the Quranic text, but if one does do so, it becomes evident that the usage of temporal adverbs denoting night with the verb Azra is not consistent with the exegetes' explanations. Not all usages, after all, can be explained as signifying a swift journey, only taking part of the night. Now, aside from Q, Azra appears in 5 additional places in the Quran, in all cases in the imperative. In 2 identical formulations, Lot is told to flee the impending destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah with the expression Azri by Alika by Kitan min al-Layl, so go forth with your family in a portion of the night. 15. In 3 locations, God commands Moses to take the Israelites out of Egypt. 16. In 2 of these cases no time is specified, but in 1, the setting is night, Fa Azri by Ibadith Laylan, go forth by night with my servants. 17. Scholars have noted that perhaps a night journey is not the most accurate rendering of Isra. Having surveyed the above passages, John Wansborough has argued that the original referent of Abd in Q was Moses, not Muhammad. 18. Angelica Neworth, while continuing to read Abd as a reference to Muhammad, sees a translation of exile as more compelling than night journey, especially as in the larger context of Q the Muslims fearful of being driven from Mecca are implicitly compared favorably with the disobedient Jews driven from Egypt. 19. In addition to contemporary Western scholars, the medieval lexicographical tradition provides further support for a redefinition of Azra. Abu Ishaq al-Farisi d. after explains Azra in this verse as Sayara, he made him travel, he sent him, no doubt suggested by the identical root letters. 20. There are thus several reasons for rejecting the interpretation of the Quran's usage of the verb Azra as to travel by night. A necessary first step is to examine all instances of Quranic usage comparatively. The verb Azra is thus seen to be characterized by several other features. Lot is not really being exiled, per Neworth, God is commanding him to avoid catastrophe, and the Quran gives no basis for construing his departure as an unjust expulsion in the same vein as the Jews' exodus from Egypt or the Muslims' emigration from Mecca. What the passages using the verb Azra have in common is, firstly, that the only subject or speaker to use the verb is divine or supernatural, namely, God or an angel. Secondly, all of the situations are clearly hierarchical. In 5 out of the 6 usages, the verb is used in the imperative, and in all of them the subject is either explicitly or implicitly an abd or servant of the divine will. A further hierarchical level exists if we consider Lot or Moses as intermediaries between the divine realm on one hand, and their human kin or the Israelites on the other. The divine 14 al-Razi command goes out to representatives of human groups who are, in turn, in command over their kin group, be it a tribe or a smaller family unit, the distinction between the two being quantitative rather than qualitative in such social contexts. This then implies a certain socio-political context to the use of the verb, especially in the situation of the Israelites following Moses, who are frequently depicted in a military context in the Quran. The Jews under Moses are consistently encouraged to bravely wage war for the Holy Land. 21. The Isra verse is followed by Q, which describes the Jewish scriptures al-Kitab, foretelling of 2 Israelite transgressions and 2 subsequent punishments. For most biblically literate readers, this evokes the destruction of the first temple by Nebuchadnezzar in BCE and the second by the Romans following the Jewish revolt of CE, but most Muslim exegetes saw the cause of the first destruction as the killing of the prophet Zechariah and the precipitating sin of the second, the killing of John the Baptist, Yahya ibn Zachariah. 22. In either case, the Jews here are engaged with politico-military forces, albeit against the backdrop of the consistent biblical and Quranic spiritual. In either case, the Jews here are engaged with politico-military forces, albeit against the backdrop of the consistent biblical and Quranic spiritual struggle for monotheistic purity. A final, grammatical characteristic of the verb Azra in the Quran sets it apart from extra-Quranic usages, in that it is consistently used transitively with the preposition by. This is worth emphasizing since Azra by high is evidently distinguishable from the verb Azra, used intransitively and meaning quite clearly, to travel by night, by the use of this preposition. According to the lexicons, there is no difference between asrahu, where the object is expressed by a pronominal suffix, and asra by high. 23. This is a problematic assertion, however, as in this case the b must be superfluous zaida, but it is also said that the preposition in asra by high functions as it does in akada by el kitam, take hold of the nose rein, which would typically be considered as expressing close attachment or adherence ilsak, it is not superfluous. 24. In fact, asra in the earliest sources is always intransitive. For example, all 3 examples given in Lisan al-Arab are intransitive. From Labad we have the expression Azra al-Kamu, the tribe departed in the night, Asrat ilayhi min al-Jawzai Sariatan, a night-traveling cloud came to him in the night, from al-Nabiga, and the proverbial Isra Kunfud, the night travel of a porcupine. 25. To all appearances then, the being Azra by high is to make the verb transitive bar al-Tadiya, but this construction is typical of form I verbs, not form IV. The construction Azra by high is used consistently in all 6 instances of the verb in the Quran, while it is not. 21q 22 al-Tiyabari, tafsir, used at all in the poetic corpus discussed below, or if it is, with such rarity that the examples would have little evidentiary value. This hints, despite lexicon's assertions, at differential etymologies for Azra and Azra by high. As used in the Quran, the meaning of night travel, for the verb Azra is thus untenable. It is used irregularly with adverbs of time denoting night, a redundancy. It is used in hierarchical situations where another dimension of meaning besides nocturnal movement seems to be intended, and its grammatical construction, frequently in the imperative and always with the preposition bar, suggests an idiomatic construction with a specific meaning. The traditional meaning of night travel, and more particularly the canonical interpretation of, in a single night, for Laylan, or rather, for the variant min al-Layl relies on the Prophet's biography. All these considerations argue for seeking another candidate for the meaning of Azra than night travel, either from Arabic or from another Semitic language. Saria. Lexicographical definitions. In light of non-Arabic sources, the term Azra is partially elucidated by a comparison with other Semitic languages. Among the Northwest Semitic languages, the root sry does not mean to travel by night, but denotes in all cases, e.g. Hebrew Sarah, to loosen. 26 a meaning absent from Arabic Sarah, sry, but present in Sarah, srw, as in Saratu al-Thawbani, I threw off the garment from me. 27. In Aramaic and its dialects, the meaning of to untie leads, through the sense of the motion of unpacking, to the verb shayreeth or shayra, shayreet meaning to encamp, to dwell. 28. There is no particular reason to assume that the Quranic Azra is derived from SRY rather than SRW, as the distinction would not be manifest in most form IV conjugations. Thus, the Arabic verb Azra SRW, a denominal form derived from Sarah, the back or highest part of anything, mountains, does not mean to travel by night, but to travel towards or in the uplands. At least one commentator has suggested that this may be the meaning of Azra by Abdi in Q.29. For that matter, SRWY gives us at least two other Arabic words. Sarah SRW can also mean to be liberal, generous, and its form 8, istara, can mean to select the best of something. Amongst Arabian Semitic languages, in Saphitic, however, we do find that Esrai means to travel, and perhaps even to travel by night, although it is only attested twice in the corpus of inscriptions for that language. 30. In Sabaic there are no other common words from SRWY, although SR means a valley or wadi. 31. This could have several etymologies, but Sari, meaning a stream, rivulet, in Q, is a very likely cognate. If this is the case, the root of SR could be SRY, and both words related to the Arabic verb yasri, used of water flowing. A general etymological connection is evident in both Arabian and other Semitic languages: to loosen, to travel, to alight, to travel by night, to flow, river, valley. Again, very generally, this larger context is helpful for realizing that reading Azra as night travel means passing up numerous other fields of meaning associated with movement. However, a view too wide, or a longue durée approach to a word's meaning lacks historical specificity. If it is possible to read Azra as something other than night travel, it must be situated within the context of the pre-Islamic Arabian milieu. 32. Once we abandon assumptions about Muhammad's night journey, a large number of possibilities present themselves. As we have seen, New Earth has suggested exile, although this is insufficient in explaining all usages in the Quran. Two additional possibilities from the medieval Arabic lexicographical tradition have already emerged: that Azra means to travel into the Sarah highlands, or that it means simply Sayara, or some similar term denoting travel without reference to night. These meanings are not incompatible with the pre-Islamic Arabian milieu. A final, stronger possibility is that Azra is the denominal verb of an as yet unsuggested noun. The word Saria suggests itself, as it carries with it notions of hierarchy and command that seem implicit in the Quranic usage of Azra, and there is more evidence for its usage in pre-Islamic inscriptional and Arabic texts. Instances of Azra, form IV meaning, to send forth a Saria, are admittedly lacking, but Sarah, form 2, can mean just that, and form IV Azra could carry the same meaning as its form 2, Sarah, as is so often the case with Arabic verbs. Ironically, medieval lexicographers also struggled to relate the word Saria, a sort of military expedition, to night travel. This confusion results from the medieval lexicographical strategy of explaining a non-Arabic word with reference to a more well-known Arabic root. Thus in Al-Azhari's D. Tardi B. al-Lu'a, we find that the Saria is so named because it travels by night tasrif laylan, in secrecy, so as not to give any warning to the enemy, who might then be cautious and avoid it. 33. This is etymologically possible, but what little evidence we have suggests that there was no actual relationship between the Saria and time of day. The earliest texts give examples of Saria meaning a military expedition taking place during the day. For example, during the Battle of Dat al-Rika, al-Waqidi tells us that the Prophet sent Sarai that returned at nightfall. 34. A hadith related by both al-Tirmidhi and Abu Dawood on the authority of Saqib and Wadar al-Ghamidi has the Prophet sending all armies and Saraya at dawn, Idabatha Saria or Jashan Bartahum min Awal al-Nahar. 35. Lane. 32. It is also for this reason that reading Azra as, for example, a metathesis of Seer, a possibility already anticipated by al-Farisi, cn. Above, which is clearly in some way semantically related, is not satisfying. Attempts to rationalize these inconsistencies away by supposing that this is the origin of the word, but that it came to be afterwards applied to such as march by day, as was the case in later medieval usage. There are two arguments that could be brought against such a reconstruction based on traditional Arabic lexicography. The first is the Sabaic origin of the word Saria. 36. The Sabaic inscriptions were left by monarchs, governors, and other notables of South Arabia, emerging early in the first millennium and continuing until the mid-6th century CE. 37. By the 6th century, Yemen was controlled by Abraya, a general of Caleb el-Asfa, the emperor of Aksum, located in present-day Eritrea and northern Ethiopia. Abraya had seized power following a Byzantine-supported Aksumite invasion and subsequently ruled from about 38. While not ethnically South Arabian, Abrea continued to use the inscriptional language and regnal titles of previous Himyarite monarchs, although he replaced the Judeo-monotheistic formulae of the later Himyarites with Christian expressions. He also followed Himyarite practice in attempting to exercise control over the Arabs of the southern and central Arabian Peninsula via a group of Arab client tribes, many of whom, e.g. Kinda, well known to the Arabic literary sources, were still present at the advent of Islam. His military campaigns were recalled in a legendary fashion in Q. Surat al-Fil.39. These legends had some basis in reality. One of his inscriptions, Rai, dated to CE and located at Maragan, about halfway between Sana'a and Mecca, offers one such testimonial to the